In this video, we're going to implement Mongoose and MongoDB CRUD operations on our users app. Our users app last left off from the Express router video. And in that video, we added the user router, which had a more declarative route syntax. And you can see all of these CRUD operations. For example, post does a push on the users array. All of the CRUD operations are referencing this array here with the ID variable as well. But we're going to replace this to actually use a real database so that the data will persist when you refresh the app. So the first thing we can do is to install Mongoose, which I've already done. You just npm I mongoose. And then we can create a models directory. And this is where we're going to put most of our database logic. The first thing we can do in our models directory is to create an index and then import Mongoose. And in this index, we can also connect to the database. So I'm going to connect to MongoDB at localhost/users. And then as of Mongoose 4.11, I think, you have to also pass this option, use Mongo client true. Don't worry too much about that. It's just a change that they made. And then we can also set debugging to be enabled. This will basically console log any database operations that we do, which can be helpful for development. And then the last thing we'll do is set the Mongoose promise to equal the global ES6 promise, or the built-in promise for Node. This just means that when we're doing our Mongoose queries, their promises in those queries will behave like normal ES6 promises. Cool, so that should be all set. By the way, in this connection string, MongoDB URIs are prefixed by the MongoDB : // and then localhost just means that we're going to reference our local version, and then /users, users is going to be the name of the database. And now we can define our user model. And the user model is going to be a schema that we build off of Mongoose. So I'm going to require Mongoose and then define a user schema. New mongoose.schema, the capital S. And then I can simply define what my object should look like by saying name is a string and ID is already built in. Remember the underscore ID. This is an MongoDB object ID, which is built in by default. I'm also going to include something just for fun, which is timestamps. It's an additional option to Mongoose schemas, and this automatically auto adds created at and updated at. Cool. So once we have a schema, we can export the schema as a model. So I'm going to convert it into a mongoose.model, user schema, and then that will be my default export. Now, the capital U in user is just common practice whenever you're defining a database model or an entity. It's pretty standard to use upper camel case, whereas normal variables are lower camel case, obviously. One more thing in our index.js file, we want to define the exports.user to be the default export from the user.js file. Cool. So now that this is set up, we actually don't have to touch the app.js anymore because the routers are the only things that are going to change. So we're basically going to overhaul all of this application logic to reference the database instead of the users array. So let's get started. First off, the GET request is going to correspond to a Mongoose find query. So you can return the result of mongoose.find. And then .then, after the find is done, we get our users. And then we render the users, the index template with users as an object. Let's format this really quick. By the way, the return user.find, some libraries, some promise libraries like Bluebird prefer this syntax and will throw warnings if you don't continue to return promises. So basically, I just got into the habit of doing it all the time. And you don't really have to, but it never hurts, so why not? For the post request, we're going to do something a little bit different. We're going to keep the redirect at the end, but we're actually going to instantiate a new user from the request.body. So what this is saying is when you fill out the form with a name in it, it's going to come in as a post request payload. And then with that payload, we're going to make a new user object. By the way, I realized that I should import the user object. So I'm going to just label my imports real quick. I've got npm packages, the router, and app imports. And the user model, which I need to destructure, is going to be an app import. And this // is a reference to the parent directory, because if you look at where we are right now, we're in the routers users.js. So I have to go up one to be in the root directory and then into models. So that's the relative path to get to models. And this technically is referencing model/index, but because it's a folder, I don't have to reference index directly. So now that I have a new user, I'm going to return new user.save, which will give me a promise, and .then, when the promise resolves, I don't care what the result of it is, which is why I have this empty callback signature here. But when it's done, I want to redirect to /users. And that should be good. And this should actually be enough to test our app to see if we're on the right track. I'm going to start our app with NodeMon. And if I refresh here, /users, there is an issue actually. So this is probably going to spin forever, and it's because I haven't actually started MongoD, the Mongo daemon. So we actually need to run our database before we can reference it in the connection string. But I'll try it one more time. Maybe if I actually restart the server, I can reinitialize the connection. Cool. And there's already something in the database from a previous me practicing before the video, but don't worry about that. I can probably add something, and that persisted to the database. So the two routes, get and post, are working with Mongoose operations. If I actually click on the profile, you can see the ID is coming in correctly as a Mongo ID, but we have not updated those routes yet. So let's finish the app. We don't have to touch the template rendering. So this route is fine. We already saw that that worked, but we will have to modify all of these. So let's just jump into that. Instead of finding a user in an array like that, what we can do is return user dot find by ID, which is a convenient method that just takes a string, and the string is coming in as the route param. So it's going to be request.params.id. And then we're going to .then on that. And the result of that query will give us a user, at which point we'll be able to render our template like that. So if we did that correctly, I should be able to click on Michael. And instead of the error, it's actually working. It's just rendering Michael's profile right now. Sweet. Now just for the update and delete. So the update is going to be a little bit trickier because we're going to have to set just the name field. We don't want people to be able to update the _ID. So we're going to have to be selective with what we update. And we can do that by returning user.findById and update. And then we'll pass the request params ID again. And then the actual update query is going to be set the single field name, because we're only allowing them to update name. And that's going to be set to request.body.name, just like from here. You can delete this code, and .then, once the update is complete, I don't actually care about the user because I'm not displaying it. I'm just redirecting, which is why I can have the empty callback again. Prettier, and we'll test that in a minute. Let's do the delete one first because it's really quick. So instead of splicing my array, I'm going to return user.findOne and remove. And hold on, actually. User.findById and remove. Just a little bit more convenient because we don't have to put our query into an object. We can just query by a string. So again, I'm querying request.params.id. Then, once it's removed, I can render the redirect back to /users. And the /ID/edit is the last one. And it does require a database query because it has to find the user document in order to render the edit page. So what I'll do is return user.findById, and I'll give the request.params.id again. And once we have the user, we can render the user. I can do away with this. And it should be fully functional now if we didn't make any mistakes. So let's just check. If I go to the edit page, you can see the edit query just worked because it pulled up this Mongo ID. And if I change my name to Matt, for example, that should have worked. And let's just check our output here. So we've got users.findOne. That query is being set up properly with the ID, the find and modify query. And then this set on insert thing was kind of, this was just something that Mongoose did for us with the timestamps function. But the actual set name Matt and the updated at, that was the result of our query. The updated at was also part of the Mongoose though. And then when I re-rendered the index page, it did users.find with an empty query and empty fields query as well. So that's pretty much it in a nutshell. There's one thing we can do to improve the stability of our app, which is in the event of a database error, we can provide a .catch on the promises. So if we get an error, then we can return next with the error. And our error handler in the app.js, let's see. Okay, the error handler is not actually in this file right now, but if we add the handler here, let's just build one really quick. So let's do request, response, next, and the first parameter is error since it's an error handler. And then we'll just return error.message or response.send response.send error.message. That will make the next handler work in our routes here. So we can just append this .catch statement to all of the promises that we're issuing. So anywhere you see a .then, you can bookend it with a .catch basically. And that will just like prevent database errors from crashing the app and freezing everything. Instead, the errors will actually just be caught by the error handler. All right, well, that's Mongoose CRUD in a nutshell. It can get a little bit more complicated, but you can see that our routes are definitely, the route logic is definitely getting bigger. Again, I would break this out into separate files for handlers in the future, but we'll probably talk about that in a future video. Hope you learned something, and see you next time.